Welcome to Watercooler, the Menzies Research Centre's weekly webcast where we roll out a few ideas from the lab and take them for a spin around a few sharp corners to see how they survive. Later I'll be catching up with Brendan O'Neill from Lockdown London to discuss the use and abuse of the sledgehammer as an instrument of public health policy. We'll also be discussing social media censorship and the rise of campus culture. We begin, however, with the representation of women in politics, liberal women in particular. And you don't have to be an ideological feminist to understand why equal opportunity matters in politics and parliament just as so much as it does everywhere else. 5 years ago, the Menzies Research Centre began researching the gender gap in contemporary politics. Our aim was to get a clearer picture of why the number of women in politics was not increasing as fast as it was in other professions. Indeed, the number of women representing the Liberal and National parties at that time, federal level at least, appeared to be stagnating. Our second task was to understand the challenge from a Liberal point of view so that we could develop a Liberal strategy to fix it. This week we're publishing an updated edition of that report, Gender and Politics. As with the previous editions, the report is co-authored by MP Nicolle Flint, who's my co-conspirator on this project since the beginning. And I'm pleased to say there's progress to report, as I'll be discussing with Nicolle shortly. The most notable improvement has been in the number of Liberal women standing for Parliament. If you go back to 1983, there were just 8% of Liberal candidates were women. This jumped to 25% in 1996, the year John Howard was elected, but then it fell back and plateaued at around 20%. But since 2016, the numbers have been rising again. And last year, 30% of Liberal candidates for federal Parliament were women. Looking at the federal Parliament in particular, in 2013, 21% of Liberal MPs were women, 22% are Liberal senators. At last year's election, the proportion of women in the lower house was about the same, 22%. But there was a big improvement in the Senate, where women were filling a third of the Liberal seats on the Liberal benches. That's a record number of women in the upper house and a record number of Liberal women overall in Parliament. There's still a lot of room for progress, however. Specifically in our report, we note that the gap between male and female members and office holders of the party have barely changed. Any serious attempt, surely, to get women into Parliament must begin by getting more women into the party. Nicolle, welcome to Watercooler.
Thank you for having me, Nick, and it was wonderful to once again collaborate with you and the Menzies Research Centre to do this very important work for the Liberal Party.
Now, it would be presumptuous of us to take all the credit for it, but the fact is that there has been an improvement since 2015, particularly at federal level. Back then there were 16, I think, members of the House of Representatives who were women and 6 senators. Considerable improvement really at that level now, isn't there?
Look, absolutely. And the 2019 federal election result was wonderful. We saw 7 Liberal men and 7 Liberal women elected. And that is, I would say, the first time that we have ever seen 50% men, 50% women intake in the House of Representatives.
So why do you think the improvement has come? What are we doing right now that we weren't doing back then?
Well, we're certainly much more cognizant of the fact that we need to encourage and support more women to put their hand up for pre-selection, to put their hand up, across the grassroots of the party. I think all MPs, I think they are, and I hope they are, more conscious that they need to be identifying not just talented men, but also talented women to then nurture and support and encourage in their journey to put their hand up for pre-selection and then, of course, to get them elected. I think everyone is far more conscious of the fact that we do need more women in parliaments across the nation and here in federal parliament as well.
I think one of the things that I enjoyed working on that first report was the back and forth we had. We argued long and hard. I don't think we argued over quotas. I think we were always insistent that quotas was a bad idea. That's a liberal, it's a Labour idea. It's the sort of thing a top-down orientated party would do that was interested in equality of outcomes rather than we are equality of opportunity. We did argue a lot over targets, and I think in the end we settled on the idea of targets. Just to clarify, what do we mean? What's the difference between a target and a quota, and why are targets working?
Yes, so a quota is a mandatory number that must be met, regardless of whether you might have the best man in a seat, and especially if it's a marginal seat or a key seat, you might have the best qualified man for the job, but in the Labor Party, that person cannot run for that to represent that community because there's a quota in place which says this seat is for a woman. Targets, on the other hand, which, Nick, yes, we spent a long time debating because I still felt that even a target was contrary to our principles at the time. I now realise that targets are absolutely critical to forcing people to think about, okay, we do need more women. How can we go about achieving that? So target sets a target, as a business does. A business might say, I want to increase revenue, I want to gain more customers. Our target is we need more women in Parliament, so we have a greater diversity of experience, of views, of people from different backgrounds who will bring more expertise, more experience to our national Parliament, which makes us the strongest Parliament and also the strongest party possible. So targets are about setting something that you're working towards. And what I was very encouraged by, and we put this in the report, was the Commonwealth Bank's reporting on how they have met their targets. They don't have quotas in place, they set targets that they will encourage women in junior management levels and senior management levels, but they will encourage women to step through the leadership process at every level. And they've set targets to do that, and they've achieved those targets. And so now they've improved those targets further, increased those targets further. And so that's where we landed, Nick, in our first report. And that's what we still need to see rolled out more across the Liberal Party division by division, because of course the Liberal Party is a federation of states and territories, and it's up to the states and territories ultimately to improve the numbers of women we are seeing put up for pre-selection and then elected to our state, territory and federal parliaments.
Yeah, I think allied with targets, it seemed to me at the time and still does, important that these are reportable targets. So you're accountable for them as a state division. You have to report every year. I think in the case of the Liberal Party, probably to the federal council every year what your progress is, because in the corporate world it's quite clear that the act of having to sort of show and tell actually drives action.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, I mean, key things about targets: voluntary, and yes, I agree, public, and that you are then reporting on your achievement of those targets.
So we have seen progress at the federal level, as we say, but this problem is far from fixed, and we need to do more work. And I think one of the things we noted in that first report, if I recall, was that when you actually look down the rungs of the party, everywhere from the ministry to MPs to pre-selection candidates, right the way down to just young Liberals, then the same pattern was there. It was still that 70-30 split, really, or thereabouts, between male and female. And you're not going to fix the problem of women representatives in Parliament until you actually get more women in the party and active in the party.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. And this is where I came across in my research for our updated report, the concept of the broken rung. So that concept suggests that if you don't have a critical mass of women going into the junior leadership roles or the junior management roles in an organisation and then progressing through the more senior levels, then when you're trying to find the person to be the new CEO or chairman of the board, whatever it might be, or for us, a pre-selected candidate, you don't have a large enough pool of talent to be able to find the right person, because the right person will have a pretty specific set of skills that you need. And, as I said earlier in our conversation, you, especially in more marginal seats or key seats, you need someone who really knows the community, represents the community, has the right background and skills to represent that community and come to Canberra, for example, or into a state or territory parliament and be the very best advocate for their voters, but also make the very best contribution in a policy sense to the party, so that we stay strong in terms of our offering to the Australian people. So the broken rung. So this is the difference, I think, for as long as we've been grappling with the problem of not having enough women in senior corporate and political leadership roles, people began by approaching it from a top-down perspective, just saying, we need more women, let's just find them and put them in, which first of all set women up to fail, which I think we're still dealing with the fallout of those decisions and of that approach. But it also didn't encourage more women to be given the skills and the confidence and the networks that they needed to be a successful person at those very senior levels. So the broken rung flips this approach on its head. It says we need to build at the grassroots level. We need to give women the skills and nurture them, build their skills, support them, and take them through the ranks. Not just try to ask them to step up the ladder when that bottom rung is broken and they can't.
Going back to that first report, we instinctively in our discussions reacted against the kind of feminist, leftist, ideological argument. That wasn't where we were coming from. And we went back to, as always, when you're trying to get your philosophical bearings, you go back to Robert Menzies and in 1943, when there was a big push to get women in Canberra, and indeed, the first women were elected, Dame Enid Lyons into the House of Representatives for the Liberal Party, but that was based very clearly in Menzies' arguments was about equal opportunity, wasn't it? It was about the fact that if we believe that everybody should have an equal opportunity in life, and as Liberals we believe that passionately, then there's no reason why women should not be better represented in Parliament. Now, we still stick by that argument, right? We don't go for this intersectionality and identity politics argument. That's not where we're coming from.
That's right, Nick. It's got to be the best person for the job, but we know that there are barriers to women putting their hand up for pre-selection and then being elected, and then staying elected is the other part of it as well, which is why we still need to see far more women in safe seats. In our 2017 update of the report, that was the year that I became, or the election that we looked at, that I became a member of Parliament. I was the only woman pre-selected in all of the retiring seats. So all of the Liberals who were retiring, I was the only woman pre-selected, and I was in a marginal seat. Most of my male colleagues were pre-selected into safe seats. And so that just makes it harder to, and that's been repeated for generations, really. And it makes it harder to retain women once they do get here if they've got that tough battle that they're facing every single election to hold their seat. That said, it's always got to be the best. Again, Nick, this is why targets are important. They're voluntary. It's the best person for the job. Merit is very important. And that's where we do differ from the Labor Party. It's not having women for the sake of having women. It's still having the best person for the job. But we've got a lot to do to support more women to even realise that they're the best person for the job, which is, where women's confidence comes into it, where sponsorship of women, sitting MPs or retired MPs identifying talented women in the community can do a lot to say to them, hey, have you thought about running for the Liberal Party? Have you thought about joining the Liberal Party? And here's all of the things you need to do, and then actively advocate for those women to put their hand up and help them on their journey.
The other leftist citadel we've taken on this time, I think, is the idea of diversity, because the diversity on the left has become, a sort of watchword for everything that's good and virtuous. But I think we've looked at diversity from a broader perspective. It always seemed to me that one of the reasons why we needed more women in Parliament was for women bring a different approach and a different experience to life. I'm sorry I'm old-fashioned like that, but women do often have a different experience, background, philosophical approach, sometimes education, etc. And that was going to benefit the Parliament. But the idea that gender in itself was, you know, important, or even worse, that, you know, your ethnic background or those sort of things, you know, they were, to my mind, almost completely irrelevant to politics. It was the experience that you bring and the approach you bring, and so that we have a parliament that's truly representing every person in the country. And I think we've made progress on that, don't you?
Absolutely. And so our updated report for the first time looks at the background of women, but we also know the men, particularly in the class of 2019 intake, came from such an incredibly broad range of backgrounds. We have doctors, psychologists, former defence service personnel, so veterans, university vice chancellor, and what is really, I think, encouraging and exciting for the Liberal Party is that we do have this diversity of background, both within our women and our men, and that's what helps us to make the very best policy possible, helps us to better stay in touch with the Australian people, because, as we know, Nick, when we look on the other side of the chamber to the Labor Party, almost all of them have some sort of union background. I think they have a lot of lawyers, but so many unionists. So when you're coming from such a similar and narrow life experience, you're not going to be representing the Australian people as well as I think the Liberal Party does, because we have such a diverse range of people from very different backgrounds who have lived the breadth of Australian life experience. You know, we also have farmers, we have a lot of small business people. That's what keeps us really strong.
Oh, it's great, isn't it? We've got a certified pest controller in Parliament, Luke Howarth, and it seems to be no better skill required in politics than pest control. And we narrowly missed out, incidentally, on a tree surgeon in the seat of Lily, and somebody who can handle a chainsaw. I think that's a very useful skill in Parliament too. But from your point of view, in Parliament now, in your second term in government, how does that work on the ground in Parliament, in the party room, having people like that in the room with a different viewpoint, possibly a viewpoint much closer to that of many working Australians? How does that dynamic work in the party and in the Parliament?
Well, as I said, Nick, it just means that we've got people who have lived the great breadth of experiences that Australians go through every day and have gone through in their lives. So it just means that you've got people who give a different perspective, a new perspective on policy positions, and that helps us to make sure that we are staying in touch with the Australian people and delivering for them on the issues that actually really matter to them.
That's great, Nicolle. Just finally, what's your outlook for the future? How do you see this changing in the next Parliament and thereon? Where do we go next in this area?
Well, Nick, we know that we still need to see greater reporting and active target setting and the meeting of those targets across the divisions of the Liberal Party. And I guess if there's one thing that disappoints me is that it's still not across the board that we're seeing uniform reporting on all of the benchmarks that we set out at the end of our paper. That said, we've just seen a fantastic result. Federally, we had a record number a really healthy number of women running for the Senate. I think 40% or so of our candidates were women, which is a great result. We just saw 7 women elected to the House of Representatives in 2019, as well as 7 men. So that is a 50-50 outcome without a single quota in sight. So that's very reassuring as well. We just need to see all of our divisions looking at this and saying, okay, what did all of these states and territories do to support women into safe seats as well? We had a couple of women elected into very safe seats, and I look forward to them having a really long and successful career. That's what we need to see, is just more women able in a position to put their hands up for pre-selection, so that we've got the strongest fields possible within the Liberal Party. And that means a strong field of both men and women when you get to the point of pre-selection, so that those pre-selectors can select the very best person for the job.
Well, thank you for taking the time from politics to help us with the report yet again, and all the best for your long and successful career in politics.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Look, I don't need to tell you this has been a challenging year, challenging for the country, challenging for our health services, challenging for the economy, challenging for small business. But it's challenging too for think tanks because so much has been happening this year. The pace of debate, the direction of debate seems to have been moving at such a fast rate. It's often hard to keep up with it and make sense of it. Fortunately, however, though, we're not alone. There are good people all around the world applying their minds to this. One of those is our good friend Brendan O'Neill, the editor of Spiked Online and a regular contributor to Watercooler. Brendan, welcome back to Watercooler from lockdown London. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Nick. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
This has been, I think, one of the few heartening things to come out of this year of rolling crises, and we'll talk about those in a minute, is this great conversation that's going on now all around the world. You've got podcasts going, podcasts in the States, which we both listen to, and we're toing and froing, and you join us and we join you. It reminds me, I don't want to overblow this, but it's a bit like Vienna in the start of the 20th century, isn't it? It was some of the great brains of the 20th century. Yeah.
Absolutely. Can you imagine if we were going through this COVID crisis and this man-made craziness in a time before the kind of technology we have today? It would have been so much worse. I think the one upside of the COVID hysteria, as I see it, is that we are able to connect, we're able to have these conversations, we're able to be dissenting across borders, even if we're not allowed to physically cross some borders. So I think the ability to have these kinds of conversations is probably something that's helping a lot of people get through these fairly dark months.
Yeah, which I think opens a question in my mind. If we hadn't had the technology, would we have persisted with this lockdown so long? With all those public servants and commentariat who make these decisions, would they have been happy to sit at home without this connection?
Yeah, I mean that is a good question, and one of the things I've been thinking about is the class differential in terms of the impact of the lockdown, because the elites can carry on working from home, and for lots of them it was a really interesting little social experiment. They live in nice houses, they probably have gardens. They can carry on doing their jobs. They can get their food delivered by the precariat who deliver food for a living and get badly paid for doing so. The supermarket shelves of their local organic stores were still being stocked by badly paid workers who still had to go to work. So for the elites, it was probably an interesting experiment. But for many other people, the lockdown has been a disaster. I mean, here in the UK and in the US, and I'm sure it's the same in Australia, the job losses are going to be absolutely huge. Britain is heading for the worst recession in history, and vast numbers of people are now claiming universal income, which is the very basic welfare benefit that people need simply to survive. So for a huge number of people, it's been nothing but pain. They've lost the ability to plan their futures. They've lost their ability to make a living in many cases. So I think a lot of people are feeling exhausted with the lockdown and are pushing back against it, but are not entirely clear how to do that because, of course, anyone who questions the lockdown is immediately written off as a COVID conspiracy theorist or someone who wants old people to die. So it's a difficult thing to dissent on, but it's essential that people do.
Well, I think the big thing that surprised me out of this year was the readiness with which people became docile and just accepted this authoritarian style of government and style of policing, which scared the bejesus out of me. I'm sure you too. And the second big surprise is how difficult it is for anybody to protest against it. I mean, so you've had anti-lockdown protests in London. In Victoria, when people tried that, there was the most heavy-handed policing. They couldn't get off the grass, and basically no protests. It is. People are feeling frustrated, aren't they? They would like something different to be happening, and they can't actually control it.
Yeah, people are feeling incredibly frustrated, and they feel a real lack of control over their own lives. And I think that's not a feeling people often feel that their own lives are not their own to determine, but that now this year they felt that in a very real way, that they don't have basic control over whether they can leave the house, whether they will have a job in a few months' time, whether they can save money for their daughter's education or their son's wedding. All those things that people think about and plan and do has been torn away from them, and they've been plunged into this period of almost dystopian uncertainty. So people definitely feel like that. I agree with you. One of the things that terrified me at the very start of the lockdown was the levels of compliance. And I think it's down to the fact that for the past 3 decades or so, we've had relentless narratives of fear. I mean, the politics of fear has become pretty much the only game in town in many cases, whether it was the terrorism issue, which was often blown out of proportion. And now, ironically, when terrorism is a serious problem in Western Europe, it's underplayed and no one wants to talk about it. Of course, there was the climate change politics of fear, stranger danger. All these things over the past 3 decades, I think, have had a very negative impact on people's sense of confidence and on communities' sense of confidence, people's belief that they can negotiate risk, negotiate uncertainty, carry on living freely, even in a world that has dangers around. I think people have lost the ability to do that. So when the virus came and the media class in particular engaged in an extraordinary campaign of fear, I think it was very successful very early on. And the problem that the British government had was trying to break the stranglehold of fear over people. So 3 or 4 months into the lockdown, the government decided it was time to ease it. But opinion polls showed that people were still reluctant to go outside, still reluctant to go back to work. And the government really struggled to get people's confidence back. But that's because they had spent 3 months terrorizing the public. And when you terrorize the public, it has consequences. But I think now, as we come to the end of the year, I think we are potentially reaching a situation where, for very practical reasons, people just feel exhausted with the lockdown because they're wondering how they're going to make ends meet, whether they're going to have a job. Whether that becomes a big political pushback, I think that is up for question. But I do sense people tiring now of this constant in and out of lockdown, which we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that makes it problematic is that there's little political leadership in opposition to this. There's one strategy. It's a completely novel strategy, by the way, never been tried before on this scale or for this length of time for any virus. The empirical evidence just isn't there because we're conducting an experiment in real time, but this is where we're going. And it's hard to see any opposition stand out against it, isn't it? I mean, how's Labour doing? What's Labour arguing? Heavier lockdown or less lockdown?
No, Labour in the UK wants more lockdowns, and they're even making Boris Johnson look liberal in comparison. Boris Johnson has turned out to be the most authoritarian prime minister in living memory. Now, that's not entirely his fault because we're in a very strange moment, but that's what he has turned out to be. And Labour, of course, want him to go even further. So at the moment, the Labour Party here in the UK is calling for another national lockdown, which would be absolutely devastating. And in fact, in Wales, where Labour is very influential in the Welsh Assembly, Wales currently has a lockdown which can only be described as psychotic. It's gone into a 17-day national lockdown. All non-essential businesses are shut down, pubs, restaurants, gyms. People can't travel out of the country or into the country or even leave their local town. And we've even had the situation where in supermarkets, because they are still allowing people to buy food, in supermarkets, they've taped up non-essential items. So if you go into a supermarket in Wales, you will see that all the books have been hidden away and covered in tape. Clothing has been hidden away and covered in tape. Birthday cards. The Welsh government has decreed in its infinite wisdom that books are not essential, birthday cards are not essential, flowers are not essential. And the Wales situation has really brought home to me what a terrifying moment we're living through, because we now live under a technocracy, a bureaucracy, which assumes that it has the right to tell us what is essential in our lives. And what it's basically saying is that all you really need is food and water and protection from disease. And if you have that, you should be happy. But of course, as philosophers down the centuries know, People need far more than that in order to have a good life. And when we have governments telling us you don't need books, you don't need a birthday card for your grandmother who's turning 100, you don't need to buy flowers to put in your living room, then we've really reached a dystopian situation.
We have, and I'm always trying to check my language because it sounds like we're going over the top, but when you look at the objective facts of what's happening on the ground, we may be understating it, I think. But interesting, that book idea, there was a variation of that in New Zealand, where the New Zealand government, Jacinta with the big smile and the baby, decided at one point that fiction was non-essential. Non-fiction you could buy, but I thought at a time like this, you're just crying out for a bit of fiction, aren't you?
But absolutely. But it's I think New Zealand is a good example of a lot of the problems we face at the moment, because you were saying there earlier that it's very difficult to push back against this, and it's almost impossible to protest against it. I mean, there have been protests in the UK, but they've been very heavily fined. And of course, we've had that complete disparity. I know you've had this in Australia too, where Black Lives Matter protests went ahead pretty much unmolested. The authorities in some cases stood back. Some police officers even took the knee in London in front of Black Lives Matter protesters, let them tear down statues, all that kind of stuff. But as soon as there are protests against the lockdown, the police go in with truncheons raised and shields raised, and there's been lots of street fighting. So we've had that real political policing, effectively, where if you have the wrong views, you're not allowed to protest in public. But in relation to New Zealand and the landslide victory for Jacinda Ardern, which I find really worrying and depressing, because I think one of the consequences of COVID-19 is that I think it will re-empower the kind of technocratic section of the political class, and it could have a negative impact on the populist moment, which I think has been a very important moment. Both, Brexit, Trump, the victory of Scott Morrison to a certain extent certainly took everyone by surprise in Australia, various other political events across Europe. There has been lots of examples of ordinary people making a radical change to how politics is conducted. And I think one of the negative impacts of COVID-19 is that it will boost the claims of the expert class that they are really the only people who can be trusted to govern society. And I think we might see the revenge of the technocrats, and Jacinda Ardern's victory has put blood in their nostrils. And if Biden wins as well, I think we will definitely see a really important political turning point.
Yeah, I think we should just put a marker down and say, because people end up watching and listening to these over a long time, that we are talking, end of October? We're awaiting the US election next week, I think, and so we don't know the result of that. I don't think we're going to make a prediction, are we, Brendan? Are you brave enough to predict it at this stage?
I think Biden's going to win, but I would not want to put any money on it, because, as we know, politics at the moment is unpredictable.
Yeah. Peter Robinson from the Hoover Institute was telling me, he said, when I put that question to him, he said it's a heart and a head problem. Your heart wants to say. But yeah, that's where we are. What I think is interesting about the lockdown is it has become a tool largely of left-leaning governments. I mean, there are exceptions to that. We might think that the Johnson government in Britain has been a little too heavy-handed, but if you look around the world, there's a clear pattern, right? New Zealand, state of Victoria in Australia, Labor state, heavy lockdowns. Places like California, heavy lockdown, but Florida, not so much. Republican governor who believes strongly in business. So, you've got the situation where is it Disney? I don't know never the difference between Disney World and the other one, but the one in Miami is open, or the one in Florida is open, the one in California is closed. This, I think, reflects there's something behind this, and it's the ideology that the state knows best, that the state can control everything from the top down. It's a Soviet-style model. And what we've seen is a repeat of what we saw in Germany in the late 20th century that actually when you try that, you divide a country up into a top-down command economy and then a bottom-up liberal free market, you know which one's going to triumph. And that's what's happened here, I think, that a more liberal approach in which people voluntarily commit to helping their fellow men and women, and the free market's allowed to come in and do things like track and trace, works a lot more effectively, delivers services. Is that a fair observation, do you think? Does that match what you see there?
Yeah, that is a fair observation. I mean, as you say, the outlier in a lot of this is Boris Johnson's government, which I just think has made some really bad decisions over the past 6 months. And it's done so under extraordinary pressure from the media elites in Britain, who went absolutely berserk in March and April. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, I had to stop watching the TV news. It was so bad. It would just zap the life from you. It was so depressing to watch their constantly fearful coverage. And they put a lot of pressure on Boris to lock down, which is something he didn't initially want to do. And so did the Labour Party, and so did the left. So Boris is a bit of an outlier because he went along with this against his better instincts, I think. He was initially interested in taking much more of a Swedish route, and he ended up taking an Italian route of a pretty severe national lockdown. But you're right, across the board, it has been kind of Labourish governments who've been more keen on the authoritarian measures, more keen on the lockdown. And I think that's because it's a natural fit for them. Over the past few decades, social democracy has been in crisis. It's been in crisis primarily because it is now so removed from ordinary people. We know this from the Australian Labour Party, the British Labour Party, various parties in Europe, particularly in Germany, where the Social Democrat Party has had its worst election results since the Second World War. And all these parties are increasingly removed from ordinary people, from working people. They've become colonized by the kind of graduate classes and the well-educated middle classes. One of the great ironies of the Labour Party in Britain under Jeremy Corbyn is that the membership became even more middle class than it had been under Tony Blair. And, Tony Blair was seen as this great turning point who made Labour from a working class party into a middle class party. Corbyn pushed that even further. And so these parties are now run by experts and incredibly well-educated people and people of a bureaucratic mindset. They're not run by the kind of people who used to run them 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. They're run by people who think they have to, in a very patrician way, look after ordinary people because, they're a bit feckless, they're not very intelligent, they're a bit overweight, they're a bit unhealthy. They have these kinds of prejudices, and they've had them for a long time. And what's happened in COVID-19, in this crisis, is that all of those prejudices have come to fruition, and they've seen locking down the population, stripping them of all their liberties, preventing them from going outside in some situations. They've seen that as a perfectly logical, perfectly good way to manage the masses. So I think all of their prejudices are coming out. But what they don't realize, I think, or maybe they do and they don't care, is that they are storing up so many problems for the future. Economic problems, social problems, mental health problems. All of their policies are going to have a devastating impact, and there will be payback for that at some point.
A lot of this isn't new, this sort of condescending attitude to the working class. George Orwell writes about this in the 1930s, and it goes back much further than that, of course. But I think what you have makes it extra edgy, in my view, is that there's a refusal to give any honour to the wisdom that's come before them. They just dismiss every previous way of doing anything. In fact, worse than dismiss it, they condemn it. And so they come with no background, no context. It makes it particularly dangerous, I think, doesn't it? That they're doing this with no historical knowledge or reference point.
Yeah, these are year zero people. We know that because halfway through the COVID crisis, they all supported that moment of year zero hysteria when people were tearing down statues and trying to rewrite history and trying to decolonize the curriculum in schools and universities to, basically paint the past as one horrible event after another. These are people who, and the problem with the year zero mentality is that it's staggeringly arrogant, because what it says is everyone who came before me was wrong. Everyone who came before me was racist and evil. And it's down to my generation to cleanse the past and correct the populace. And I think that really has been the mentality of these people for quite a while. And what COVID-19 has done has allowed them to implement this stuff in a very extreme way. And I think you're right. Not only do they see, they look at the past and wisdom and precedent as things to be just ridden over roughshod, but they also have no regard whatsoever for the wisdom of ordinary people. And their failure to engage ordinary people in a discussion about how to deal with COVID, their unwillingness to trust communities to take initiative themselves to protect themselves from virus, which is what Sweden largely allowed people to do. Their unwillingness to do those things, I think, has been catastrophic. So they have this disdain for the wisdom of past generations. They have this utter disregard for ordinary people's ability to negotiate risk and to determine the best way to protect themselves and their communities from outside threats. They have no regard for any of that. And so it's just this constant top-down authoritarian measures, which they think, if you look at Jacinda Ardern again, she is celebrated as this wonderful success story because she basically closed New Zealand's borders, created a situation where New Zealand, can never really open up to the world again if it wants to stay free from COVID. And the events in New Zealand will have a bad economic impact as well. And yet she is being celebrated even by Remainers in the UK, who are supposed to be the open borders lobby. So their authoritarian instincts have just exploded into public view. And I think many more people can now see that.
Let's look at what's happening on the left and this divide. You can see it starkly in the United States, of course, in the Democrat Party, which has now got a very strong, powerful and cashed up new left element to it, represented by, I guess, the candidate for vice president versus the candidate for president. You've got this divide. People are talking about woke versus Woodstock on the left. This is an inevitable point at which there was going to be a clash, and the woke generation, those who come imbibed in campus culture, are coming out now challenging the old left. It's a clash. If you see it in those terms, and you could look, the same's true in Britain, right? You could talk about the Labour Party there, and to some extent the Labour Party here. But if you see it in those terms, there's an inevitability about it, isn't there? That the campus culture, the woke culture, will become the dominant culture on the left if it's not already.
I think that's right, and I think it's heading very much in that direction, because the older left, the left that was interested in the economy and living conditions, is on the defensive, or has just been defeated, I think, by this emergent woke left. And I think the woke left is a real problem. And I've always thought that at some point it would explode from campuses and spread onto the streets. And that's exactly what's happened this year. If you look at the footage, for example, of Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington, D.C., screaming in the faces of diners who are just trying to eat a meal, or going into suburban areas and screaming, "Wake up, mother effers." This is the extremity of campus culture becoming a reality in daily life, in public life. And it feels very destabilizing and quite threatening and almost neo-Maoist, these kind of these woke guards taking to the streets to smash down statues, correct people's thought, attack people who have wrong think. It's all very reminiscent of China under Mao, the Cultural Revolution. And I think a cultural revolution is taking place. I think the old left is being wiped aside by this new woke left, who are pretty ruthless and incredibly divisive, very destructive, obsessed with race, obsessed with identity, obsessed with these incredibly divisive ideas. Very different to the left of the past, which used to talk about the unifying nature of class, people coming together despite their differences in order to struggle for better pay or conditions or whatever it might have been. The left used to speak in the language of unity and the economy. Now it speaks very much in the language of identity and virtue signaling, narcissism, nothing to do with tangibly improving people's lives. So the left is changing enormously. And I think this new woke left has been victorious. I thought the events at the New York Times this year actually really summed that up and were probably more important than people realized, where you had the opinion editor who was effectively sacked because he published an opinion piece by a senator who said that Trump should send the army in to quell the Black Lives Matter protesters. Now, at the time he wrote that piece for the New York Times, that was a position that had widespread public support in the US. And what happened is that all the new young woke reporters and writers at the New York Times staged a rebellion. They went online and said that this column hurt them, made them feel unsafe. This is the language of the campus hysterics. And they were successful. He was pushed aside. And the new opinion editor who took over said, listen, anyone at the New York Times who feels pain when they read something, come to me and we'll sort it out. So even the New York Times, that august liberal institution, the high point of American liberalism and kind of old left American politics, has been taken over and colonized by these new people who are incredibly intolerant of diversity of thought and who want to force everyone to think in the same way they do. The conquering of the New York Times in 2020, I think, will be a very significant event.
Yeah, but let's get this in proportion. When we say, and you used the word that they've been triumphant, only triumphant on the left, right? I mean, you can see in the United States right now a very fiercely fought election campaign that at this stage, as we said earlier, it would be a brave person who bet their house on it. So the contest is still there. But I think what's happening is on the right, we've got this sort of fatalism, the end of the world. We've got the same sort of, catastrophism built into our psyche as sometimes on the left, because their catastrophe is COVID or climate change. Our catastrophe is Joe Biden as president. We've got to get out of this mindset, haven't we? And just say, no, this is the contest of ideas. The battle is there to be won. We've just got to go out and make sound, principled, sensible, understandable arguments against it. And we know that the majority of people will respond.
Yeah, I think that one of the great contradictions of our time is that public institutions seem to be dominated by these kind of woke elites who hold very eccentric views and very intolerant views. But political sentiment in the public at large is not really of that ilk at all. People voted for Boris Johnson, people voted for Trump, people voted for Morrison, people in Europe are voting for parties which run incredibly counter to the new orthodoxies of political correctness. So this is the real tension. The tension is between these woke elites who represent a very narrow section of society and public opinion, which is rational and sensible, although public opinion, I think, has taken a real beating this year because of the COVID crisis. So that's the tension. But I always think about the 1980s, and I think you and I have discussed this before, Nick. The very strange thing about the 1980s is that Western politics was dominated by Thatcher and Reagan. So it was dominated by that kind of right-wing pushback against the excesses of the 1960s and that sense of relativism, and a pushback against consensus politics and a kind of resurgent right who wanted to establish traditional ideals and capitalist ideals and so on. But at the exact same time that those people were electorally in power, we saw the institutionalization of political correctness, the institutionalization of the new feminism, the idea that men and women need to be policed and men are bad and the patriarchy is bad, the institutionalization of environmentalism, which went on to play an incredibly important role in terms of global governance and correcting people's thoughts and lowering people's horizons. So it's very interesting that even as the right enjoyed electoral success in the 80s, that kind of woke left in its early days was really taking power in the institutions. And I think something similar is happening now in terms of the electoral successes on the side of populists, but the woke left is really taking over, not taking over, but massively influencing institutions. So in the UK this year, we've had institutions like the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, you know, the bodies of the Enlightenment in this country, absolutely core to the cultural power of this country. They've been falling over themselves to remove offensive exhibits. The Natural History Museum is talking about removing any reference to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, arguably the most,
you're kidding me,
right? Arguably the most important scientific mind of all time. I mean, his influence on the world just cannot be overstated. But because he went on, because some of his trips overboard to investigate nature, because they were done on colonial ships, therefore he's a bad person, he's a racist person, he must be cancelled. So the fact that such serious institutions are going along with the eccentric worldview of that kind of narrow political section of society, that kind of thing I find very worrying. And I'm concerned that under the surface of political life, which at the moment is actually quite healthy and there's a lot of contest, I think under the surface of that, we are witnessing the institutionalization of some pretty backward views.
You provided the segue for me. I wanted to get on and talk about science, Charles Darwin. This was the moment, COVID was the moment when Western science, the scientific method could have really redeemed itself. You know, it's been in a little bit of trouble, quite a bit of trouble. I don't know if you've read a new book by Stuart Ritchie, Science Fictions, where he talks about the amount of fraud, outright fraud that had crept into science. It was in a bad way. It could have redeemed itself by scientists getting together, saying, rising to support the human race through this crisis. We're going to get together, we're going to put aside all our differences and just work out how to work our way through this virus. But actually the very opposite has occurred. People sometimes accuse people like you and I of discrediting the science. I think the science is doing a very good job of discrediting itself at the moment. You know, look, the World Health Organization, of course, very early on says, you know, face masks are useless. Other bodies say they're useless, even dangerous. But now we've got a Danish study of 6,000 people that shows that face masks don't make any material difference to the spread of COVID-19. But none of the mainstream journals, the Lancet, any of those will even publish it. Science has just got in a very, very bad way very quickly, hasn't it?
It has, yes, it has. It's really the exhaustion of science, or the self-corruption of science, I think, has become very clear this year in a very worrying way. I think it's been a long time coming. I think the real problem we've had over recent years has been the tendency of politicians to rely on science, or to rely on what they refer to as expertise, to push forward certain policies. You know, evidence-led politics, that was the great rallying cry of the past few years, past few decades, which really spoke to the way in which politics had become the dominion of the so-called expert classes, which had a very diminishing impact on democracy and the idea that you know, the country should be governed by the interests and the desires of the people rather than by the wisdom of so-called experts. So on many issues, you know, how to raise children, the issue of climate change, many of these kinds of issues, governments constantly lent on science and said, well, we're going to do what the science tells us to do. And that has a corrupting impact on politics, because politics, as I say, becomes, you know, slowly but surely less democratic and more dominated by the kind of graduate classes. And it has a very bad impact on science as well, because it seems inevitable to me that if science is continually called upon to justify political policy and moral agendas, then it will inevitably become corrupted by that process. You will see the emergence of science that bends itself towards particular agendas, or which, you know, if scientists know that there is a particular thing a government wants to hear in order to pursue a certain policy, they may well end up providing what the government wants to hear. So the falsifiability of science was undermined, the open-ended nature of science was undermined, and of course, we had the perverse situation where science was treated almost as a gospel in relation to environmentalism, and anyone who questioned the science was basically a heretic or a denier who had to be cast out. So it's been a long time coming, and I think what we have this year is really the end point or the latest logical end point to the use of science to political ends and the over-reliance on science. And I think one of the reasons that the woke elites and the old political establishment, I think one of the reasons they loathe Donald Trump so much is that he very explicitly calls into question the authority of experts. Now, sometimes he does that in a crude way that's unquestionable. Sometimes he does it in a way that's not particularly useful. But I think one of the most important functions he plays in political life at the moment is to call into question the governance by expertise. And that's one reason he is seen as such an extraordinary threat to the status quo as it existed before 2016. I think after this year, it's possible that many more people will start calling into question the role of experts and the right of experts to determine how ordinary people should live.
Believe me, Brendan, I would like to trust the experts. It would save a lot of time, right? It would save me having to delve into endless references online just to get to the truth of what COVID-19 is about, if I could just get the stories straight from them. But we haven't been getting that. I mean, I don't know whether masks work or not. I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but if you can't publish what seems to be an authoritative paper making one case and then throw it up for debate, it's the old John Stuart Mill thing, isn't it? Testing error against truth. How are we ever going to get to the truth? Something we can trust.
That's right. And that's why it needs to be an open-ended process. And, whenever you call into question the rule of experts, of course, everyone says, oh, you're a Philistine, you're an idiot, you don't trust science, you're anti-science, you're anti-enlightenment. That's not the case at all. I think science and expertise play an incredibly important role in society in particular areas. If I get ill, I want to be treated by a doctor. I don't want to be treated by the man on the street who's never studied medicine. So we all value expertise. We all value scientific insight and scientific. We could do more of that. We could do with more of that rather than with political science. The problem is when expertise and science are then mixed with politics. And the reason that's a problem is because democracy, whether people like it or not, and it's become clear over the past 4 years that many people don't like it, democracy is ruled by the people. Democracy is a process which engages the views and passions and interests of everyone in society. Everyone has an equal say. The woman who cleans the offices of the Royal Society has as much right to determine the future of the country on polling day as the incredibly clever scientists who work at the Royal Society. That's how democracy works. And in my view, that's an incredibly good thing. It brings people into an intimate relationship with society. It gives them power. It makes them think of themselves and the world around them in a very different way. It makes them possibly engage with ideas, take part in debate, and therefore we need freedom of speech. My view is that democracy is the best political idea mankind has ever had. And over the past few years, however, that's come to be undermined by the fetishization of expertise. And I think what we need is a world in which expertise is a discrete pursuit, a very important one, but a discrete pursuit, whereas politics and morality and the question of the future ought to be hugely wide-ranging debates involving all people. And so with the COVID crisis, the way I see what experts should be doing is carrying on studying the virus, examining it, coming up with a vaccine, thinking about masks, telling the truth about masks. They should be doing all of that. But even as they're doing that, the huge moral question of how society should function in the face of a viral threat, that has to be a democratic debate. That has to be a debate about what people need. And that has to be a debate about balancing the threat posed by COVID-19 with all the dangers that have been unleashed by the lockdown. So that kind of discussion hasn't taken place in a real way, which I think is really problematic. And instead, we're reverting to a pre-2016 world in which the experts were treated almost as gods who could tell us what to do. They can't tell us what to do. They can tell us what this virus is like, but they can't tell us how our societies and our communities should respond to it.
We began talking about this crisis a long way back at the start of the year. We've continued to touch base every now and then, and this crisis morphs from a medical crisis to an economic crisis to now a cultural crisis, a strategic crisis. But I think since we spoke last, one thing that's coming to the fore very much is the crisis in social media, that these platforms, which we thought would be there for free and open discussion, turn out to be some of the most heavily censored forums for discussion we have. What are we going to do about it? What can we do about it?
You know, I've been talking to some friends about this over the past few days, particularly following the extraordinary situation where Twitter prevented people from sharing the New York Post story about Hunter Biden and the laptop from hell, as Donald Trump rather wittily called it. Now, lots of people say that the laptop story is not true, that it can't be verified, etc., etc. Fine, whatever. Let us make up our own minds on that. But when you have vast corporations using their power to prevent people from sharing stories published in one of the oldest, most continually published newspapers in America, then we have a problem. And in fact, Twitter went even further. It locked the New York Post staff out of their Twitter account until they agreed to delete, I think, 5 or 6 tweets. This is, I keep thinking, where's the left? Where is the left when the capitalist classes of Silicon Valley are throwing their weight around to such an extraordinary degree that they are preventing a newspaper from communicating with its readers on the internet? It's a really staggering state of affairs. And I think we're going to see more of this. And my fear is that neither the left nor the libertarian right is well equipped politically for this new culture of censorship, because on the left, many on the left support it because they're very censorious anyway, and they love the fact that feminists who question transgenderism can be banned from Twitter, so-called racists can be banned from Twitter. They cheer whenever this happens, so they love it. The libertarian right is not well equipped because I think they have a tendency to fetishize property rights, or at least they elevate property rights too highly, in my view, above the freedom of speech. So they will often respond to instances like this by saying, well, you know, these are private companies, they can do what they want. I'm afraid that's not good enough. It's not good enough in a time in which these private companies play such an extraordinary, almost monopolistic role in public debate. And when they play that kind of extraordinary role in public debate, there should be huge pressure on them to respect the freedom of speech of everyone, whatever their political views might be. So the way in which Silicon Valley, the mask has been ripped off, in essence, over the past few weeks and over this past year. And Silicon Valley has very explicitly become a tool of officialdom. And I think that's a really worrying development.
Yeah, well, a lot to talk about there too. But look, Brendan, just finally, do you feel optimistic about Britain right now and how well it's going to come out of this recession?
Right now, probably not. But I think there is a huge amount of political and moral resources in this country. There always has been. And the thing that gives me some optimism is, of course, that we're still living in the Brexit moment. And the Brexit moment was a demand to take back control. That's what we all voted for in 2016. Take back democratic control, give people more power, give people more say. I think that's an incredibly positive ideal. It's been dealt a real body blow this year because, as I said earlier, we feel very out of control now of the most basic elements of our lives. But that desire is still there. And I think that's really the clash that we have at the moment. The clash is between ordinary people who want more sovereignty, you know, individual sovereignty, community sovereignty, the right to make serious decisions about the world they live in, against a political class, particularly the left-leaning political class, which thinks that it should have the control and that bureaucrats and experts know better and that it should tell us what to do. That was the clash in 2016. I think it's still the clash now. And I think one exciting thing about 2021 is that I think that clash is going to become even more apparent, and we'll have lots of debates about who should govern society and in whose interests it should be governed.
Well, here's a prediction. I'll make a firm prediction that whatever nonsense the left throws up in 2021, Brendan O'Neill and Spiked will be out there fighting it. So thank you for... Spike just gets better and better. Your podcasts are going off. Thank you for everything you do there. And look, most of all, thank you for joining us today on Watercooler.
Thanks a lot, Nick.